Well, I got upset enough with the news this morning, starting with the story about cyberbullying, so that I thought we should talk about some current events um, tonight. And the first idea that I want to talk about is the definition of sophistry. Okay, so sophistry is the use of fallacious arguments. Let's see, can't even read my own writing.
With an intention to deceive.
Yes, okay. The use of fallacious arguments with the intention of deceiving.
Right.
And so we hear that a lot. But before we talk about that topic tonight, I wanted to talk about cyberbullying, because one of the things that we need to do in the online community, by and large, is we absolutely have to get people to grow up and mature. And the problem is that we've had a culture online for at least 30 years that allowed everybody to be anonymous. So everybody could act out and be their shadow side, and nobody will take responsibility for what they are doing online. And one of the important things to understand is that we have, tens of millions of children around the country who are just learning how to be human beings. That's what happens when you're born. You have nothing, and you have to go through many iterations of the Job archetype: contest, defeat, lamentation, and rebirth, in order to build up your ego to the point where you can handle any criticism or whatever. And we have a whole spectrum of people in the population globally who haven't been through enough of that development. And also, they don't understand it. They think they have to be perfect little boys and girls, and if anything goes wrong, it's the end of the world. And that's very frightening to me. And so this morning, I didn't really hear the entire story, but I heard a story on one of the cable news outlets about a young teenager who was bullied online, and he doesn't have a strong enough ego, and so he committed suicide. And that's a horrible outcome. And so we have to understand that there are a lot of people that are online, that hear things online on the news media or in chats on your iPhone or whatever it is, that just can't stand up to that kind of pressure. And of course, we know several bullies in the public sphere, and those people are people that have known that they could get away with it over many years, and they did get away with it. And as a result of that fact, they got worse and worse, and bullying is their main tactic. And it's only when we call bullies on their misbehavior that they themselves learn that maybe they shouldn't do that. And so one of the things that I'm concerned about is the fact that we do have so much anonymity on the internet. And I've always used my own name unless I was using a pseudonym for some sort of creative purpose, like a play or something like that. But I tend to use my own name so that I take responsibility for what I say. But if you are using a pseudonym, then you're not taking responsibility for what you say. And I think we have to mature beyond that. We have to come to a point where we can believe in what we stand for as individuals. And if we don't do that, then we're going to let the bullies just take over the world. That is my view. So, Jerome, any thoughts on this?
I think it's sad that somebody would think that their whole image or something is destroyed by some random thing somebody says online.
Well, they don't think that. There's no thinking.
I know, but
as what I heard this morning was that this young kid's character was simply crushed by the way people behaved toward him online. And they said they assassinated his character. And if you're a young kid and you don't know any better and you don't have much experience, that can be crushing. And so we need to understand that what we do, whether it's online or anywhere else in life, has an impact on others that we talk to.
Well, and how can we communicate that?
Well, we're doing it right now.
Yeah, okay, we'll do it this way and say, hey, don't pay attention to that stuff. It's not worth, I mean, you've got a whole life ahead of you. And if you take something somebody says online seriously, I mean, just take it, change your attitude toward it some way. But I remember, back in school when I was a kid, we had bullies at school. I met my first bully.
Yeah.
And fortunately, I wore glasses. So he came up to me and I said, if you break my glasses, you're going to have to pay $50. So I never heard from him again. But it was kind of scary because he was known as a bully.
Well, and there are consequences to confronting bullies. But Anthony Roberts, let's see. Okay. Anthony Roberts says, we've taken bullying and competition out of the current generation. I hate to sound cold, but without a healthy dose of bullying, people never seem to tackle adversity. And Anthony, you put on another statement here that you use profanity, so I'm not going to show it, but he says, I'm a millennial and watching Gen Z scares me. Real life is hard. Whatever happened to sticks and stones break my bones. Well, Anthony, the problem is that words do hurt and they're very painful, and many marriages fall apart because of abuse, spousal abuse. It's usually by the man of the woman. And we haven't grown up. We have a huge population of men in the country, in the world, who think it's okay to abuse their spouse. And it's been reduced somewhat, but we still have 50% divorces in the United States. And that's caused by one, spousal abuse, two, by infidelity. And those are the two main reasons, I would think. And so women have to grow up and men have to grow up. We all have to develop a strong enough ego to handle the slings and arrows of life. But
there's also physical the abuse, but there's also mental abuse, which the mental abuse sometimes, and that's part of what the online bullying is mental abuse.
Right.
But there's two kinds of abuse. So there's physical and mental.
Right. Okay. So people push you around. So I was in the fourth grade in a country school that had fourth, fifth, and sixth grade in the same room. And a kid that was a farm kid, he was a year older than me, used to push me around because he was bigger than me and so on. I talked to my dad about it, and he said, you know, a hard-boiled egg is always yellow inside. And boy, do we ever see that on our television today. But the point is that the next time this kid tried to push me out of line for a drink of water at the drinking fountain, I just said that to him. I just said, a hard-boiled egg is always yellow inside. And suddenly he became my best friend. It was just incredible.
Yeah.
But
Well,
I do.
They say a bully is compensating. So
Very definitely.
what he puts out front, his face, his persona, is a overcompensation for something that he really lacks.
Right.
And so he
So I
puts
was
that out
told by
there.
a psychologist in my area that our president, has a teeny weeny little ego because he's always trying to bully people. And so he can't face the fact that he's really not strong. And, and he thinks he can just bully people left, right, and center. And he's been attacking his own people just as much as other average Americans. And ultimately, that the payback on that is going to be very painful for him, because karma is perfect and it works to the fourth generation. So we'll see what happens, but I don't think it's a very good thing. Now, I do agree with you, Anthony, that we've taken competition out of the current generation. And I observed that in, for example, soccer moms, who every mom wants their kid to get a trophy. So if the kid's team is the worst team in the league, they still want the school or whoever it is that's sponsoring the soccer league to give all the kids a trophy. Well, I'm sorry, that's not the way life works. And we need to toughen up our children and let them learn that, you know, they can lose. They let them learn that they need to be sportsmanlike. I had some fun with my Irish son-in-law's brother over this weekend because the Japanese team beat the Irish team in rugby in the World Cup in Japan. And you know, he said, well, the best team won on the day. And so that's a very sportsmanlike attitude to have. And, you know, the opposite attitude would be something like, well, we'll crush those guys the next time, or something like that. But, you know, we have to learn that sports are about learning how to face actual life. And the only people that are having an authentic experience in a sports stadium are the people that are on the field. Everybody else is just a watcher. Everybody else is just vicarious, and they're not actually in the fray. And so if you want to have a life, if you want to have meaning to your life, which is this big crisis now that Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke and Paul Vanderklay are talking about, then, you know, you have to have an authentic life. You can't be carried along by others. And so you have to get in a life. And I've been observing John Vervaeke's, apparently it's going to be a 50 lecture series on waking from the meaning crisis. But what John Vervaeke is doing is he's defining meaning in smaller and smaller slivers, all on the rational side. And yet meaning in the context of what they're talking about is actually a feeling that comes from the psyche, and it comes from the psychological side, the unconscious side, not from defining it. And so, you know, when you're looking back on your life, you're not going to be thinking about the, I don't know, at least 50 hours of John Vervaeke lectures and thinking, wow, did I check that one off? Did I check that one off? It didn't work that way. So anyway.
I watched the last Vervaeke and Paul Vanderklay interview.
Did you?
And what's interesting is that Vervaeke's conclusions is almost that his what he calls participation lacks essence. And what we're looking for here is, where's the essence? Where's the life?
Right.
How do we get that out? And Vervaeke's coming up with his final participation, whatever it is. It doesn't have any essence with it. And of course, Vanderklay was all over that, because he said this is what religion provides.
Right. So now Anthony says, I hate to sound cold, but without a healthy dose of bullying, people never seem to tackle adversity. Well, people tackle adversity all the time. I mean, we have sports teams in all school levels, and there's all kinds of competition. There's competition for boyfriends and girlfriends and all sorts of things. So there is adversity, but
well, I think sports is, when you go in sports, it's about teams and working as a team and functioning as a team,
right,
and getting along with your teammates. And, that's the learning and the experience of it. And what you say, I don't see, I don't understand his point, in other words.
Well, I mean, I think the point, what you're missing, Anthony, and I want to be respectful of your age, is that that's an easy excuse to allow bullying. But the fact is that when we mature, when we're actually mature, we don't need to bully people to make our point, because we make our point. Okay, it's totally unnecessary. I mean, for example, I lived in a hole in the ground in Vietnam for 4 months with a Sergeant E5. I was a first lieutenant at the time. Now, I could have bullied him and given him all kinds of orders and that sort of thing, but that's not the way you have a good relationship. So when we were in the hole, it was always Skip and Jerry. But when we came out of the hole and we put on our tunics, and he had his sergeant chevrons on him, I had my lieutenant bars on, then there was no question about who was in charge. And there was no need to bully to achieve that, because I had the maturity to be the lieutenant and he had the maturity to let me be the lieutenant, to respect me and follow my direction when we were doing marine things. But when we were doing living things in the bunker, then you have to live with people and you have to get along with people. And so if you bully people, it won't be good. And the apocryphal story is that lieutenants that did that in Vietnam, as soon as their average life expectancy in a firefight was 15 seconds. And the reason was that if they'd bullied people and gotten too big for their britches, they would have gotten a bullet in the back of their head, not the front of their head, and in a battle. And so you need to be mature enough to know where you stand and how you can make your necessary power for whatever it is you're doing hold true and keep working for you. So MBS Perry says, this is true. Children have had their environment sterilized over the years, and we have more sensitive kids. I'm only 21, but growing up, you had to have a thick skin because that's just how kids are. Well, that's true. That is how kids are, because children who are wild animals, and they have to learn to behave in the adult human world. That's why we don't treat children as adults until at least 18, and in many cases until 21, because until you're that age, you don't have enough maturity to take adult responsibility. And so it's a process that you need to learn, and every child needs to learn it, and every new birth is someone learning it. And so we have we've made things better for children. And I think it's been a bit of a process, and Jerome, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that after World War II, the generation that were our parents, the World War II generation, typically had a very rough time during the Depression. And this is certainly true, for example, of my mother-in-law, who was born in 1930. And so she was born into a very tough time in the Depression. And then her 11th birthday was Pearl Harbor Day. And so she's having a birthday party, and all of a sudden the United States is at war. And so those people had a very rough time in their childhood. And when the war was over, they pretty much wanted to make things better, not only for themselves, but also for their children. And so as we were growing up, we had good Christmases. We were still not wealthy, but things were good because my mother had learned crafts, and so she made ornaments for the Christmas tree and that sort of thing. And we did have competition in Little League and Pop Warner football and those sorts of things. But then after about mid-1950, then things started to get nasty, because my generation was getting sent off to be cannon fodder in the Vietnam War. And more than 58,000 of us were killed. And probably at least double that number were maimed in Vietnam, or had their life cut short some other way, like being exposed to Agent Orange. And so our generation, the men got a little bit less trusting of the government. And meanwhile, our wives wanted to make everything hunky-dory for our children. And so that's where this issue came up of every kid gets a trophy, instead of only the kids who do well in sports. And the result is, as you point out, that kids were sterilized or sterile. They had a sterile environment because everybody got a trophy. So everybody was wonderful. Well, there has to be a balance, because you can't crush someone's ego and crush their future, but at the same time, you do have to compete, and you have to learn to properly compete. And so there's a very important balance that is involved there. And I don't accept the idea that a healthy dose of bullying people is necessary. That's absolutely not necessary. And I'm going to stick with that point.
I'll stick with it. Anyway, I was thinking what you were saying. Yeah, my parents went through the Depression. My father was a pilot in World War II, and he got the GI Bill, so he got an education, which he would not have been able to. And then from that standpoint, my mother was very frugal in terms of, if we had a meal, she would take a napkin and tear it in half and hand one to me and one to my brother, and she kept doing that all her life. So
yeah,
just to be, she couldn't get over that particular fact of, things may happen where it gets worse, but we did have competition, and when we got a trophy or a medal, we really earned it.
Surely. Yeah.
We were proud of it, when we got that. So, and I don't know, in some respects, there's a lot of competition in school today for certain particular jobs in schools, and
Right.
you can look at it both ways.
Oh, yeah. Obviously there is, but we have to learn to compete. And, I think a lot of kids are deer in the headlights. I mean, some group of kids in school do very well and they're just going to sail through. And a lot of kids just roll along with their class and don't realize that, oh, by the way, they have to also step up. And it's not only the kids that are doing well in school. And by the way, MBS Perry, your response that includes profanity has been monitored or moderated by YouTube, and I'm not going to allow it here. You can continue to participate, but please watch your language. Okay, info overdose says very detrimental to psychic health. I think that one thing that we have to be very clear about is that we need education for young people on psychic health and what psychic health actually means and should mean to everyone. And Mama Lama says the biggest bullies are in our government, unfortunately, on the left, mostly, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, but I was bullied some as a kid by family even. It's tough. I recovered from it okay, but I'm a bit of a rare breed. I don't happen to agree with you that the biggest bullies are on the left, because I know what I know over the last decade that's happened to me, and the people who have bullied me or tried to get me to give up were definitely GOP involved. So I think that there's some of it on both sides, and what we have to do is we have to reflect on what we love and hate and see what it is that we don't like and recognize that it's within us. And I'll just give you a personal example. I'm not particularly impressed with the way our Senate is being currently handled. But on the other hand, when I was a senior in high school in 1964, I was participating in a model UN. And the issue that was to be debated in the model UN was, should the Union of South Africa, which was then an apartheid country, give up its attitude of apartheid? And I was assigned as the ambassador from South Africa. And so everybody else was just at the model UN to have a good time and give their speech and so on. And what I had to do was read up on the Robert's Rules of Order and interfere with everything they tried to do in the model UN all day, all afternoon long. There were two topics, and mine was the afternoon topic. And so I behaved during that model UN exactly like I see Mitch McConnell behaving in the Senate. And so I have to recognize that that behavior is also within me. And I have to face it in that way. In other words, in a balanced way, in a way of understanding the other person's point of view and what they're trying to do. Now, ultimately, there will be a solution. And in the case of South Africa, ultimately there was a solution about 20 years later. that did end apartheid. But in terms of that day and that experience, about 2 months later, I was on the ski slope for our senior trip, and a friend of mine and I were skiing down, and a young woman fell in front of us and broke her leg. And we stopped to render aid. And this, after we got her out of her skis, she turns over and looks up at me and says, "I remember you, you're South Africa." So I definitely made an impression on her. So anyway, Anthony says, "I was bullied in elementary school and middle school. If the things I went through then had happened today, it would have been an entirely different situation. People should be kind to each other, but legislating it is not American." Well, actually, legislating it is American. That's how we keep peace in the country. But we also have to be able to defend ourselves and to have people's respect. And so I'm sure that that was very painful for you, Anthony. And I'm sorry that you experienced it. But yes, you're right. So, to a certain degree, experiencing that in school, where you have a whole classroom of wild animals that haven't matured and haven't grown up to understand other people's rights. That is difficult, and it's part of life, and that's how we learn. So MBS says it's actually true that women commit more domestic violence than men do. Men are just a lot stronger, so when they do it, they really mess up their partner, but men do not commit more domestic violence. Well, I think that that might not be statistically accurate, but I don't have the statistics right here. And so I'm not going to argue it further. Jerome, do you have a reaction to that?
No, I don't know what the statistics are, but I mean, what we're discussing is how we treat each other in terms of it doesn't matter in a sense as to whose side is right or wrong on the thing,
Right.
but we're still treating people badly. And the bullies, if the bullies realized what impact they might have on someone, they might think twice about what they're doing. When you realize that sometimes these people explode, because they can't, they hold that stuff within them.
Well,
What
and
we're trying to do is what in Jungian terms is what you said before is all of that is within us somewhere.
Right.
Okay. And so we could be bullies if we wanted to.
We could
that's
be
down
bullies.
in
Yes. Bullies. Yes.
We could be bullies. It's
Right.
there.
Right.
And so what we need to do is bring this forward. And that's what the whole individuation learning process of Jungian psychology is about, is to recognize that that's within you and bring it forward.
Right. And I think the other thing that we don't teach well in this country, but which is taught in Asian countries, is this idea of yin and yang, where, let's see, have you gotten that? I guess you have.
Yes, it's there.
All right, which is that we train individuality as we are a whole thing, and the way others teach it in the world is that we're part of a community, we're part of definitely a part of a pair when you're in a marriage. And let me see, there's a better yin yang symbol here, which is this one, where it goes deeper. Okay, so that you have layers within layers of yin and yang. So, if you're a male, you may have a feminine part to you, and then within that feminine part, there's also a masculine part of the feminine part, and so on. And so these things are in layers in our psyche, and there are opposites, because the opposites are where we get our psychic energy. But we have to understand that our psychic energy does come from a pair of opposites, not only one, but thousands of opposites. And so,
Yeah, and these opposites are supposed to be complementary.
right.
And most people
And
think of it as apart, and they're supposed to be to complement each other. And
sure,
because if you're in the center, you're centered. If you're
right,
too far apart, you're either too logos or too eros.
sure.
In terms of what we're
And
trying to do is.
so in a marriage, both men and women have to learn to respect their partner and respect that they're bringing something different to the relationship, whatever it is, whether you're gay, whether you're lesbian, whether you're heterosexual, whatever it is, you and your partner are both bringing something to the party, and your partner is helping bring out something that you don't have a facility to really do well. And so they help bring it out.
Or you haven't developed that part of you yet. So some of this in terms of development, you can develop that part of you, but they also complement you, and you're able to learn together.
Right. So in terms of Info Overdose and Anthony Roberts here talking about you can't legislate speech, it's really more an idea that we have to educate people in a proper way so that they can be more properly respectful of one another. And that's a very difficult problem. And it's an ongoing problem. It's not just if we do it now, we're done, because it just goes on and on. So we have to keep trying to resolve it.
Yeah, I remember when I was on the debate team, we had the rules to follow, and each side was civil to each other, and you learned to communicate that way.
Right. Okay, so Anthony says, Overdose, absolutely. Trying to convince everyone they're a winner despite losing will only work when everyone agrees to the same rules. And as we see in our politics right now, no one agrees to the same rules. Okay, and the fact that we have a country at all is because for most of our national history, there have been at least major rules that we have respected. And what's happened in the last decade is that respect for the rules has just evaporated. And when we don't respect rules, then we have chaos. And this is Jordan Peterson's point. you just invite chaos if you're not going to accept the social structure. And that works both ways, because, I encountered the Maryland courts that refused to follow the rule of law themselves. And I'm one guy, and they're strong, and so I couldn't beat them. But ultimately, if you keep doing that as elected judges, ultimately, who fights your wars? Who will fight your wars if people don't believe that their society will be properly managed, and if they won't be respected by the rules? In other words, by given an opportunity to make a case in a court of law, for example, which I was denied for 9 years. And so I felt very strongly about it. I went to the Court of Appeals of Maryland 5 times, which involved also going to the mid-level court of special appeals in the state of Maryland 5 times also. And I went once to the U.S. Supreme Court, and my rights were just ignored, basically. And so when we ignore our rights, people's rights, then how do we have a country? That's the question. And I asked that after 40 years as an attorney, and my whole life around the U.S. military. Since I was born, my father was a naval officer from the get-go. And so if the powers that control our government won't follow the rules, who else will? That's the question, ultimately. Okay. Moving on. Mama says, Skip, we live in a social structure that encourages divorce and animosity. Most people have a hive mind and just follow the current map. I agree with that. And we need to start waking up, coming into a new stage of consciousness. That's one of the major things that I've been working on over the last year, especially, but through my Jungian work since forever. MBS
I like her comment about the hive mind, because that is so true in terms of we go along with that, and we've become anesthetized. We've become numb into that, and we don't realize that we're there.
That's right.
What we're trying to do is to say, hey, wake up.
Right. All right. So MBS Perry says, this is also much the responsibility of the parents. Jerome makes a great point. My mother always told me that people were mean to me because they were jealous of something about me. I think your mother was probably right about that. And MBS Perry says, also, if kids never lose, then they truly will never understand what it means to win. The shame and sadness that accompany losing are essential to building strong character in children. Absolutely, I agree with that entirely. Sean says, wait a minute, it just popped up on me, so I can't keep up. Sean says, reminds me of the linkage of the yacht picture, never enough. Materialism hierarchy creates a bunch of empty people. That's precisely correct. And Anthony says, you don't need to bully people to make a point, but people do bully people, and ignoring that reality will do you no good. Okay, that's fair enough. And people need to be taught how to respond to a bully. And we're getting a classic example of that in this country on every news media, 7x24 right now. And we'll see how that works. Info Overdose says, bullying others is not the solution, but tough love is. It can't be all flowers and sunshine, because life is certainly not that. And I agree with you to a certain degree. I mean, it's matter of maturity, Info, and it's not a matter of, a father can't come home and whack his kids because he has something going on at the office and he has to get something off his chest, so he comes home and whacks his kids. And I just was faced over this past weekend with my wife and a close friend who have been involved in a Buddhist group called Rigpa over the last 30 years. And they're quite disappointed now because it turns out that the leader of that group was abusing people. He was literally hitting them. And if people said, don't hit me, Rinpoche, which is his honorific name, don't hit me, he would hit the person next to him. And so he was a bully. And finally, some people said, this is not on in the 21st century, and you just have to stop. And so now the organization that he founded, which originally had 40,000 members, or not originally, but built up to about 40,000 members, and centers all over Europe and the United States. It has disintegrated, and yet the people at the center of that group refuse to acknowledge that that was inappropriate, and they're just trying to pull the group back together again and trying to pretend that this guy was totally okay. And that's not okay. It's not okay that the Catholic priests abuse children, and it's not okay that the Catholic clergy has celibacy. I mean, the popes can wake up finally and say, this isn't working when we have celibacy, and therefore our priests go and abuse kids all over the world. What kind of a clergy are we? And it's not only the Catholics. It's happened with Protestant clergy as well. It's happened with other religious clergy too. And so people who get into a position of power sometimes abuse that power. And what I was seeing with my wife and this other lady were, they're crushed because they've committed so much time and energy to their Buddhist studies, including my wife including both of them did 3-year retreats in Buddhism, which means that they had enough education to be the equivalent of taking vows and being ordained in any other religion. And so even though they never became ordained, they certainly are well knowledgeable about Buddhism, and they're just stunned. And so one of the things I'll be talking about in my talk on October 27th is that all the world's religions have to be reinterpreted. That's the great task going forward for our religions, which is not to throw them out, but rather to reinterpret them for modern times. Because in Buddhism, traditionally, people got away with being abusive, apparently. And they'd say, well, that Rinpoche is an abuser, and that's a teaching about life. Well, that's not okay. That's not the way we have to be in the future. And that's not acceptable in the 21st century. We can't have clergy going around committing assault and battery. And so all the religions have to be corrected. So Jerome, go ahead.
Yeah, some of the Zen masters, they would teach and they'd hit you with sticks. Actually, in the early training days, they would hit you with a stick, and that was supposed to reinforce your learning.
Sure.
The nuns would come along and they'd hit you with your stick, or if you weren't paying attention. So some of that was, that's been carried forward from that.
Yeah, that was baked in, and all that stuff has to be reevaluated. Because, I was in the Marine Corps actively for 23 years, and I still carry my commission. And I never saw abuse in training in the Marine Corps. Okay, the first day of my OCS training, I learned that no one's allowed to touch you in the Marine Corps, and I said, "Great, okay." So
don't touch me.
And they don't.
Untouchable, huh? Yeah.
And they don't. They scream at you and see if you can take difficult situations from a psychological point of view, but they don't attack you. They don't hit you. And so if you go over to Bancroft Hall over at the Naval Academy, in Bancroft Hall, which has 4,000 students living in it, the freshman class goes around, and about 16 hours a day, they're required to jog down the center of the passageways. And every time they get to a corner, they have to shout, "Go Navy" or "Beat Army" or something like that. And so when you have 1,000 kids shouting like that, 16 hours a day, you can imagine it's quite bedlam in that dormitory. But the reason that that's there is it's a form of screening and training, because it's quite chaotic in battle, as you might guess. And so they have to find out who can handle the stress of having that noise and chaos going on around them all the time. But
Yeah,
they don't hit anybody.
Yeah, but they have to weed out the ones that may cause a problem in terms of working as a team, as a troop going forward. So
Absolutely.
You also mentioned about the disappointment of the people of your wife's leader being, and how some people do not want to believe that.
Right.
I don't like to say the word cult, but cults, not in the negative sense. It's a group of people that are bonded together for some reason around a leader who may be charismatic, and he attracts those particular people because he's got some sort of energy or archetype going on.
Right. And what these two women were observing last Saturday night is that within this group of 40,000, there was a very tight-knit central group that probably had no more than 20, and they were the cult. They were a cult for sure. Yeah. Others were just followers of a religion, but
yeah, it tends to grow up on leaders like that, and the secondary team are the ones that become the ones away from it. You know?
Yeah, but a lot of people are facilitators of that sort of thing. So, number one, you can't stand for it, and number two, you can't allow it. And we all have to stand up to that. And if we don't stand up to it, we get walked on, no doubt. And so Anthony says, as far as bullying in sports, if you're in any sort of sport above peewee football, there has always been a tradition of hazing in fraternity sports and the academies. Yes, of course. And as far as I can tell, Russia and China don't care about other people's feelings and will bully as soon as they get the opportunity to. I also get the fact that Jerome isn't on the YouTube chat to read what you're responding to. Are you watching the YouTube chat?
I don't have it. No, I don't have it up. I'm just listening to you. I can't get it up on mine.
Okay, you can you create a separate window and bring it up?
Let me work on that.
Okay, well, you're right, Anthony, that in China and Russia, they treat people terribly. And so be thankful we live in the United States of America. And that's what Dr. Jung would call the power devil, right? If you get power, you start to behave like a devil. And the so-called Communist Party in China has maintained its power by their bullying behavior, but ultimately that leads to revolution. It may take 100 years, but it does happen. Info says, I think tough love is the right approach, not bullying, because tough love has a positive goal, bullying does not. There's a difference in intent when it comes to the two. Well, certainly tough love is encouraging your son to go out for the football team and not mollycoddling if he comes home crying because he got beaten up in a football game. But at the same time, if your son comes home from the football game and he's crying, or from the practice and he's crying, if you beat him up then and tell him to work harder or something like that, that's not an appropriate use of parental power. But it does happen. It happens a lot. So Anthony says, Skip, what are your thoughts on cancel culture which is decidedly left. I have no idea what cancel culture is. Have you ever heard of that, Jerome? I've never heard of it. Personally, I believe the best.
No, I'm looking at I'm trying to find where you are.
Okay. I'm probably up from the bottom because I see there's an arrow here. And so anyway, Anthony, if you have a link to what cancel culture is, you can send it to me. But he says, personally, I believe the best display of online bullying is a groupthink cancel culture where they not only attack a person's views, but their persona and livelihood. And, you know, some of those things are dangerous and they're also unlawful. And ultimately, they are going to be found out. So we have had a problem on this YouTube channel a couple of times where bullies came in and tried to screw up our chat, and now we've learned to cancel them immediately and make them so they can't come to this channel. And so people who want to debate and discuss, we're happy to have them. And that includes the people that I've criticized this evening. But, you know, I'm not going to tolerate foul language, and I'm not going to tolerate disrespect. If you want to disrespect somebody, go somewhere else. That's tough love. So, but so far we're doing pretty well since the first few. Anyway, Info says, yes, groupthink is bad, especially those who don't support diversity of thought and want everyone to share the same view. It's Orwellian. Yeah, well, we have to wake up from that situation. Anthony says, ouch, that is not how we do things in America. The First Amendment holds quite true. I would hope so. MBS, if it's not physical violence, legislation is not American. If it's not, I don't understand your point.
Hey, Skip, I've got a definition here of cancel culture.
Okay.
Describes a form of boycott in which someone, usually a celebrity, who has shared a questionable or unpopular opinion or has had behavior that is personal to be offensive, called out of social media, is canceled. They're completely boycotted by many fans. So,
well, you know, people have to learn, and when people get out of a reasonable norm of mature adult behavior, then they need to be canceled. This is why people are getting knocked off of Facebook and Twitter and so on, because we have to maturely face what people are doing in our society. And what we see is in our politics right now is atrocious, but it's going to have a consequence ultimately. And, you know, ultimately it will bend to the good side, but it may take a while. In the case of Nazi Germany, it took 23 years, and the destruction of Germany and all the crockery destroyed before it got resolved. And so hopefully in the United States, we have enough people who are sensitive enough to speak up and say, no, this isn't okay. Anyway.
Yeah, Anthony says, I'm going to read one of the comments, not just fans, people have been debunked. He says debunked, but debunked, I assume. And also I'm reading on a little bit here. It says this is a growing phenomenon, and there's a lot of people are talking about this and whether it's good or bad, the pros and cons of it.
Well, I do believe that boycotting is a right thing to do, and that's how the behavior of South Africa got changed. And sometimes it's a valid strategy, and it's a question of what's right and what's wrong, what's reasonable, what's not. And Dr. Jung's position was that we each have to make our own decision, and then we get the general we get the collection of those decisions, which is our result. And so far, because we have so much debate in this country, I'm convinced that it's our debate and our diversity that makes us stronger ultimately. But it has to be done in a mature and sensible way. And when it gets out of control and goes into violence, then you do have civil war. And we did break down to civil war once 150 years ago, and I don't believe it would happen again, but one never knows. Sean says, I believe our relationship to our mother is the backbone of psychotherapy, although I'm just a layman to this sort of thing. The image of our mother can save us from any darkness. There's certainly something to that. Do you want to comment on that, Jerome?
Hold on, I was reading another comment. I believe our relationship backbone. Yes, the initial relationship with the mother is the whole backbone of the psychotherapy, because we have to separate from that. We're in a certain state with the mother, and we need to separate and branch out from that. We kind of, I hate to say the word divorce, but we get out of that in order to become our own selves rather than stay attached.
Right.
If you stay attached, then you're forever in that idealistic dreamland zone, or whatever you want to call it. You never grow up. In other words, you're just a feeder fan, or whatever.
Right, refusing to grow up. Grenade says, do you think everyone's center is at a different spot, like a center for one person might be more logos oriented than the center for another person who might be more eros-centered, gender aside? Absolutely. Everybody is at a different stage, and everybody needs to recognize that.
Yeah, we all have strengths and weaknesses, and our strengths are what Jung called our primary function. That's what.
So RU4PKR says, familiar with the concept of fourth turning, ? I don't know what you mean by that. There's certainly a concept of a fourth in alchemy and in psychology in general, but I'm not sure if fourth turning is some movement or something. I don't know of it. And Grenade says, is everyone's center universal? Well, it's universal in the same way that all oak trees are oak trees, but also all oak trees are different. So, we all have a center, but where it is on the spectrum of possibility can be anywhere. China's been harvesting organs from live Muslim detainees in concentration camps. Well, that's pretty horrific. For something like that, if that were happening in this country, I might be interested in revolt. Anthony says, not just fans, people have been debanked. What are some of the problems with atheism? Matt says, well, I think the fundamental problem with atheism is that it says that you don't have to follow the tenets of any specific religion, and that gives an excuse for not following the ethical rules. And so therefore you have to have pretty good ethics in your own mature life. And if you do that, then there's nothing particularly wrong with it. It's as valid as any other. The problem is when, say, God is dead, and we turn away from religion, as John Vervaeke wants to. He says, oh, we're not going back to those old religions. Well, yes, we are, because those religions have evolved naturally, and they're the way human beings have survived for millions of years. And so, so you can't rationally slice and dice meaning and think that you've done it or done anything, actually, because meaning doesn't come from the rational side of the psyche. And so watching John Vervaeke write all his slicing and dicing up on the blackboard, I mean, I was having this when I was watching his previous video, Jerome, I always pay attention to what are the images that come up in my mind when I'm listening to something, right? And so the image that came up in my mind, the first one was the first line of Kodachrome by Paul Simon, which is, when I think of all the crap I learned in high school, it's amazing I can think at all. and you know, that's exactly what it seems like. And then the other image that came up was I was on the exercise bike in my gym, and all of a sudden I had an image of having a silver cross in my hand and being able to put it up between myself and the screen.
Stop. You say, stop it. I can't stand it.
Right.
The guy that mentioned the fourth turning, or
Right.
should
Fourth
make
turning,
assumptions, says that this is a belief that we are in an era of destruction, often involving war or revolution, in which institutional life is destroyed and rebuilt in response to a perceived threat to the nation's survival. And interestingly enough, Steve Bannon is involved in some of this thing.
Okay, well,
says he's obsessed with the fourth turning.
Right.
So,
well, what I would say pardon?
I wasn't aware of this, but that's interesting anyway.
Well, of course, there are many Christian fundamentalists who believe that revelation is the literal truth rather than a vision that this guy in the 4th century had that wrote down. And I think he'd laugh more than anybody to hear how many Americans believe what he wrote down is literal truth today. but you know, so there is a belief that that's in the process of happening. And of course, to some extent, that's always happening. But, you know, if you want to follow that sort of attitude, then you join a cult and drink the Kool-Aid. And, you know, it's kind of lemming behavior. You know, a good way to make yourself extinct is to believe that everything is going to be destroyed. So I might as well destroy myself somehow. Like lemmings, they jump off the cliff with everybody else.
We had a saying in business. You could either approach it. Some businesses go by the notion of doom and gloom, and that's all they preach. And they want you to get to work because you know the end is coming, all that stuff.
Right.
And the others to have a more positive attitude towards your customers and customer satisfaction. So that's the positive model.
Right. So Info Overdose says censoring people who say horrible things is immoral, but also impractical. If someone is that bad, they should be allowed to express themselves so we can see who they truly are and then avoid them, which I agree with you, Info Overdose. There's this old saying in Pennsylvania Dutch culture, which is, it's a prayer, and the prayer is, God, please change their hearts. But if you can't change or turn their hearts, dear God, please turn their hearts. But if you can't turn their hearts, please turn their ankles so that we will know them by their limp. And Grenade says, cancel culture can be taken too far. Absolutely. What happens when we start censoring the wrong opinions, which has happened, and absolutely it's happened. And so we have to all make our own judgments on that. But I do agree that we have to treat the First Amendment as sacred. And if we don't do that, we are going to destroy ourselves, very simply. As he says, people have literally had their ability to bank and use platforms like PayPal revoked. And then there is an issue of Operation Choke Point, which was implemented by the Obama administration. I have no idea what you're talking about, Anthony.
I think that's debanked.
Debunked.
I said debunked, but he made a correction and it said debanked, which just means you're being debanked.
You're being thrown out of organizations. Well, I mean, people do get shunned. I mean, all we have to do is imagine what will happen with the President of the United States when he leaves office, regardless of whether he leaves office because of impeachment, of losing the election, or because he runs out of his election. And, you know, how many people will come to hear him speak then? You know, that's shunning. And that's a traditional thing that happens. And so people we have to be mature enough to live in our societies. And that's what, as young people under 21, we're learning how to be a mature human being so that we can live in our societies. And if we don't have enough maturity for that, then we're going to be shunned one way or another and weeded out of the collective, so to speak. And so are you for PKR says this is a Strauss-Howell generational theory. Okay, well, it hasn't gotten through to my generation as yet. Sean says, I believe the image of our mother is the inner mandala of light to the self. Yes, I agree with that. Are you for PKR says revolution, civil war, world war now? Well, I did raise the point of civil war in the title for this evening. And so I just want to point out that these battles never end, okay? And so even though we don't have a shooting war between the North and the South of the United States anymore, and that ended in 1865, in many ways, the U.S. Civil War is still on and hasn't ended since 1865. And I don't know, Jerome, you live in the Deep South. From a Civil War point of view, would you concur with that or not?
I was born in Kentucky, so I don't know if that was kind of on the borderline. So I'm in the middle on that. So,
right.
No, I don't see any. I mean, daily around where I live, around town, people are just very nice, and it's like this politics is kind of overblown to us in terms.
Yeah, it is overblown. I agree with that, but a lot of
we have nice families. We have people helping out. We have good school systems. I mean, it's very pleasant in terms. And then you hear this news going on, and it's like there's something out of proportion here. So
yeah. So are you for PKR says every fourth generation, about 80 years, sees a paradigm shift in American culture? Well, American culture is paradigm shifting constantly. That's what the reality. And, if you look at American culture 80 years ago and now, yes, you'll see a lot of differences, very definitely. But the way people behave today is more or less the way people were behaving, when I was born. And it's not 80 years yet, but almost. And, there's not been a great shift, except for one thing, which is that my grandfather was a totally bigoted guy, and he was always saying nasty things about anybody that wasn't like him, whether it was because of color, because of um, religion or whatever, or national origin. And because he was that way, I'm the compensating factor. I'm the exact opposite of him. And so, yes, there is a paradigm shift in that sense. And when I reported, the night I reported for active duty in the Marine Corps as a second lieutenant, the what was it called? Resurrection City was built on the mall in downtown Washington. There were about 40,000 people living there, and four second lieutenants from the basic school had been to their party celebrating the end of their program, and men came into the bar where they were and shot them dead. They were in dress blue uniforms, and things were pretty bad. But later in 1985, when I came, and in those days, you could not go east of the U.S. Supreme Court on Capitol Hill without taking your life in your hands, literally. Now, when I came back to Washington in 1985, my wife and I literally lived at 1200 East Capitol Street, which is 1 mile from the U.S. Capitol, and it was quite gentrified by then, and you weren't taking your life in your hands, although there were still issues, and there still are issues. But let's not overblow things. Things are getting better, no doubt.
Yeah, Washington, D.C. is, they've cleaned up and is fairly safe. I lived in Georgetown for a couple of years and would walk to work all the way, all the way into the inner city, or take the tube, the subway and everything. So it's
Right.
very, of course, there are a lot of people looking out, agents that were around that you didn't know were there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, Grenade says, scary future when they'll take away your ability to buy and sell if you speak against them. That's an issue. And so, Christ said it, render under Caesar that which is Caesar's, and render under God that which is God's. So if you're going to aggravate the government, that's the physical world, okay? And the government is going to come for you, absolutely. Nancy says, we need to learn dialogue where we listen to each other and make sure we hear what they're saying. Absolutely. I agree entirely with that.
Yeah, it's kind of like they make so much noise that you really can't hear what they're saying. They're trying to be so, I almost think it's like they're bullying just by doing this at the same time. That's their strategy, in other words.
Right. Well, and of course, as I indicated with my grandfather, if somebody's making a lot of noise trying to protect themselves, it typically means that the opposite is true, and it will have an opposite effect on a majority of people, I think. And so you have to understand that these changes take place invisibly within the psyche. But if you were attacked by a bully every day, how would you feel about that person over time? And you can recognize that if you were in their position, you might do the same thing. I certainly can recognize that personally. But that doesn't mean I justify it. Okay. It doesn't mean that I think it's okay. I can, from a Jungian point of view, I can understand that I have that evil in me too. And yes, if I was in that person's situation, I might do exactly the same thing. And as I indicated earlier from my Model UN experience, I would do the same thing. But that doesn't justify it. That doesn't make it right. And I'm prepared to stand up and be counted that it's not right what in certain circumstances. So, and Anthony says, Google Operation Choke Point won't let me put the URL in. Well, I'm sorry for that. And you, as I said, you can send it to me at skip.conover@gmail.com and I'll take a look at it. And info says, yes, we have a civil war when it comes to morals, values, etc. Certainly we do. And we can talk about that a little bit more after a bit. Sean says the Paleolithic man with an IQ of 180 was surely still making fire the same way. Yeah, pretty much. I don't think they were using nuclear energy, but but short of that. And he says, I think Skip is missing the point that some in the government are getting private companies to enforce the things they do not have the legislative ability to do so. And what I know is that major companies, major banks simply ignore the legislation and the rule of law. And so, you know, things have gotten really wild and woolly in the rule of law in the United States, and especially in the economy, almost more than anything else. I mean, none of our life savings are safe. And we just have to hope that we can support a situation in our financial community where people are moral, because if they're not moral, then we're all sunk. What would you do if you lost all electricity tonight and you lost your cell phone and your access to the internet? Then what? Okay, I mean, it's happened to me several times here in Annapolis where we lost power because of big hurricanes or something like that. And I'll tell you what, you feel bloody vulnerable these days because we don't have a way to communicate other than through cell phones today, mostly. And, I don't even know if groceries would be delivered to the grocery store if there was no power. And if
I live in the mountains, and we have frequent ice and snowstorms. And last winter we had power outages for 5 days and 3 days and stuff like that. I had a generator,
right.
But you're almost back to, you're building fire in the fireplace, and you're back to the old times. Everything is quiet and
right,
fire crackling and stuff.
Yeah, it's a rougher way of living, and as a person.
I was freezing.
Right. As a person who didn't have a hot shower for 6 months while I was in Vietnam, and even though it was hot over there, taking a cold shower in 40-degree weather in the wintertime is no joke. And so lots of us live, I mean, Helena, Montana had a blizzard over the weekend. So if you live in a northern clime where you're relying on power and snowplows and that sort of thing, and you don't have those, do you know enough about hunting to provide for yourself? I mean, really, the diet might get pretty thin. And so Shansa, let's see. Anthony says, I think Skip, oh no, we already did that. All right, moving down. Info says, yes, because we have tech monopolies now, because the internet is still new, we are still adjusting. Yes, I agree with that. And we better adjust in the right way. That is because the changes in the law before the real repeal of Glass-Steagall investment and retail banking were separate for 60 years, and they should be still, but we've allowed them to put all our money in one pot, and so we're going to all have a financial crash. Okay, there is going to be a financial crash. Last week there was a scare where an event in the financial industry that hasn't happened since the crash of 2008 happened. And so this is in overnight funds transfers. And these are based on banks trusting one another. And when banks lose that level of trust, then things really go bad. And when they really go bad, then the government in 2008 bailed out the banks, but but the problem is that the crash destroyed the middle class and harvested the life savings of many people in my generation, including me. So I'm not happy about that. And all right, so are you for PKR, says dishonest money? And Anthony, what money? You mean that thing which you could loan out at 10-to-1 ratio? Actually, they loan it out at a much higher ratio than that. And the leverage is much higher than 10-to-1. And that's why the economy crashed, and it's going to happen again because when the GOP got in power again in 2016, they knocked off all the controls that have been put there after 2008, and so it's uncontrolled again. And when it's controlled, at least we have a little bit of common sense. But when it's not controlled, people get greedy, and then we have a problem. And it can be worse. Okay, I wanted to mention just before we go further that I just published an interview with Tim Holmes, who is a terrific artist out in Helena, Montana. And Tim and I had a very, very interesting, challenging debate with, not challenging one another, but an interesting debate, a discussion with one another, and discussion about Tim's art, which is really interesting and exciting. And I urge you all to go look at that interview sometime soon. It's been on, it only was up on the channel as we came online tonight, but it's really a great one. I've spent all afternoon or evening last night and all day today editing it. And I think you'll really enjoy it. And Tim is a member of our advanced reading group. So if you want to meet him live, you can join our advanced reading group. And
I mean, he's a professional artist, right?
Yes, absolutely. And just if you just watch the first 2 minutes of that video, you won't be able to stop. I can promise you that. It's a very exciting video.
Good.
And so Anthony says, on January 17, 2019, the Fed updated its reserve requirements table. It required that all banks with more than 124 million on deposit maintain a reserve of 10% deposits. Well, I don't trust that for a minute, Anthony, because the point is that the crash of 2008 was caused by the fact that the banks were doing transactions off the books of the Federal Reserve. So all the financial stuff that the Federal Reserve was looking at was not letting them know what was really happening behind the scenes. And what Wall Street did before 2008, and they're doing it again, is they created a currency that is in the form of mortgage-backed securities, so-called. They're supposedly safe, and so they went and basically created money where there was no money, and they and they did it until the leverage was so high that it just couldn't be sustained. And the same thing is going on now. And I promise you that sometime soon there's going to be another crash because they're greedy. And then they will come to the government and ask to be bailed out again. And the next time around, we have to say, no, let them crash, let them start from the ground up again, because what they were allowed to do was the government paid off all their risk, but they let them also foreclose on everybody's homes, and they weren't owed any money on those homes because those were paid off by the government. So the American people are paying double on all defaulted mortgages, once in the form of the TARP and once in the form of foreclosure proceedings. And it's not good. I'm going to publish my video on this. I've done a rock'em sock'em video on this, but in my lawsuit, where I went through 9 years of fighting the banks, the courts of Maryland allowed them to change the facts, literally change the facts, and who the plaintiff was 4 times in 9 years, and 3 times in the last year. And so they're obviously just as corrupt as they can be. And so, and Info says I should look at the art of Alex Gray, and maybe I will, but you'll have to tell me more. I think he was inspired by Jung. Maybe you could internet it. Well, certainly have him contact me. I have to tell you that I have lots of people interested in having me interview them and so on. And I've been spending about the last 2 months trying to catch up on my interview backlog. And it's a lot of running in place, I can tell you. But I'm getting better at it. And if you send Alex Gray along to me, I'm not searching for someone right now, but if you send him to me, I'll be happy to talk to him and interact with him. Okay, so Anthony says, I understand you know what you know, understand other people also know where paper goes. Well, we're not talking about paper, we're talking about little green electrons here. And so it's, there's a lot of fake stuff out here. And are you for PKR says you can't taper a Ponzi scheme. That's probably true. Carl says, I'm familiar with Alex Gray. I believe he and would tell you that his art is from firsthand experience. It may well be. I don't know that work. But I'd be
Skip. I was looking it up, and it looks like it says he began a series of art that bear resemblance to rites of passage, and they present passages to developing the psyche in approximately 50 performance rites over, and he's developed some sort of sacred mirrors of paintings. And it's a viewer on their journey to their own divine nature by examining in detail the body, mind, and spirit. So
does sound interesting.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, because I want to investigate this. So.
Right.
I'm looking at some of the paintings, but
well, I'm certainly happy to interact with anyone who is doing art that's relevant to what I'm trying to do with Dr. Jung's work here, and I'll certainly give it a good look. I think if you watch the Tim Holmes interview, which just posted, you'll see what I mean. I mean, I promise you're going to be decapitated by what Tim has done, and so
decapitated.
Yeah, I mean, just blown away. I mean, it's just like, oh my God, I can't believe that he did all this stuff, and he certainly did. It's just amazing. For example, he created a statuette, something like the Oscar or something like that, for the UN Committee on Women, which is intended to be a substitute for the fact that the Nobel Peace Prize has only been awarded in 110 years, only 10 times to women. And so the UN wanted to start offering prizes to women who had accomplished things, especially toward peace. And so they commissioned Tim to do that piece, and he was commissioned by a group of Chinese dissidents to make a piece that related to the peace movement in China and the revolutionary movement in China. And the one that I really love too, which is in the interview, is called The Christian Vine. And it relates to a priest in Palestine, and I think in the West Bank, who had come into a new church, and the priest before him had stolen all the money. And so when he got there, his neighbor, who was Muslim, came and made a gift of peace to him, which was in the form of a grapevine, and it was buried in the sand outside the church, the parish church. And then the custodian, who was a very fundamentalist Christian, objected. He said, "You have to pull up that vine. That's a Muslim vine." And he said, "Oh, would you go get me a bucket of water?" So the guy goes and gets a bucket of water because he thinks the priest is going to loosen up the soil and dig up this vine. And so what the priest did was he had the guy pour water over his hands, and then he said, "And I baptize thee in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost." And he says, "And now it's a Christian vine." And so he's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize too. So anyway, I'm always interested in artists, and so anyway, let's see. Info says, Carl says, familiar with Gray. I believe that he would tell you that his art is firsthand. Okay. If you don't bail them out, that will be a bigger crash than 2008. Well, Granat, I don't agree with you about that. The corporations are just fictions. And so let them crash and let them regenerate. That's what I say. And we let them do it the other way, and they harvested the life savings of my generation. So I'm not happy about it. And I've got 4,000 pages of proof on the record in the Maryland courts. And for anybody who wants to do a little investigative journalism, I'll be happy to talk to them about it. And I will be publishing my video before long. And so Anthony says it's called paper, and it originated as paper. Well, it's not paper any longer. And Anthony, a big issue was when things were digitized and bundled off in various grades of mortgages, legally pretty sure you still have to be able to produce a physical version of the contract, and the big issue is no one knew who owned it. And the big issue was nobody knew where the paper was, nobody, and I promise you, if you go to any county courthouse in the United States today and you try to look at who owns property and who owns mortgages, you can't tell. It's a big con. Okay, the land records in the United States are now a big con because it's all been taken off electronically and nobody knows what's going on anymore, period. Nobody knows what's going on. And I just, Grenade says, I just looked up Alex Gray, and his art looks like things I saw when I used to experiment with strong psychedelics. I can't speak to that. Info, yes, he works with the band Tool, who uses Jung's work in their music. Okay, also don't know what is being discussed there. Grenade, I recognize one of the pictures looks like the Godhead. And we're arguing semantics. Okay, so Jerome, are you prepared to respond to this Jung quote about Hitler that I sent you by email earlier? I can read it to you.
Yeah, so I read it, but go ahead and read it because before I make a comment.
So the quote is, he caught, and this is from Jung now, he caught the feeling types through their inferior thinking and thinking function, and the thinking types through their inferior feeling function. So can you talk about how someone may have been caught by Hitler through their inferior function either way? We're talking about the Myers-Briggs type indicator here, folks. And I can I'll actually type the quote into the chat so people can see it.
Okay, I actually looked at the quote, and I was trying to figure out what it was having to do with the Myers-Briggs type in relation to what Jung had written about Hitler and actually the war, because Jung thought, if you read Jung, you'll find that he addressed a god called Wotan,
right?
If you're familiar with that, and this was in one of the gods that was repressed. And so we're really not talking about Myers-Briggs. We're talking about the collective consciousness, unconscious here, where we've repressed something from our past so far down that Hitler was able to get that to emerge into the psyche of the people's unconscious, and that was his talent. And it was probably through intuition, because he was very intuitive.
Right.
And so we could say from a Myers-Briggs standpoint, but as far as affecting, everyone was affected by that. And it was, my view is that he was possessed by this archetype, which is the shadow, which would be the devil.
Right.
And it manifested itself, and it was something that people had repressed. And so
he just naturally knew how to do it.
Yeah, in other words, he got that to come out, and then they were at his command. So everyone was infected by it. It's like a virus that grew.
Right.
And so that's my comment is I don't think it's, you could look at it from that standpoint. You have to look at it from the collective unconscious standpoint, because those are archetypes.
Right. So let me see if I can address it more from a Myers-Briggs type point of view. Okay, so in those days especially, it's not so true now, because today people test about equally men and women between T and F. But in those days, women were much more on the feeling side. And so Jung convinced the women who were mostly feeling, and therefore they had inferior thinking and logic in their psyches at that time. And he convinced them by telling them that, oh, we just have to make sure that we have Lebensraum, which is living room. We have to have more space to have agriculture and so on. And so the women just didn't logic it out. So they said, okay, yeah, it sounds good. We need to have, we have to have more land for Germany so that our population doesn't starve. And the population had starved in the previous generation, or even in the previous few years when he first came to power. And so it must have sounded pretty good to the women that he would go out and take some more room for Germany. And from the on the other side, the people that had an inferior feeling function were mostly the men. And from their point of view, they say, yeah, we're the strongest. And, I don't care about those Czechs and Poles across the border. I only care about me and my fellow Germans. And so, yeah, let's go after them. And so I think that's kind of the idea. Does that ring true to you, Jerome? Jerome is an expert on the Myers-Briggs, folks, so that's why I'm especially turning to him.
At some level, what you're saying is would be correct for those people that are like that, but you have to also remember that you've got introversion types that are the exact opposite of the extroversion types. You've got intuition types that are extroverted. They see the outside intuition, and you've got the ones that see inside intuition for introverted types.
Right.
And so we're all a combination of these types, and we have different strengths and weaknesses.
And sometimes at different times also.
Right. And so I couldn't really nail it down to that. What I was looking at was more of what Jung said about it, which was the Wotan and the reaction to that. So I agree in some sense what you were saying, but at the same time, we tend to, for instance, a strong thinking type, does have their opposite. In other words, if your main function is thinking, extroverted, then your feeling is going to be, which would be unconscious almost. It's the weakest link.
Right.
And so
anyway, you're not even feeling emotion. Yeah.
Well, remember, emotion comes from a different place. Feeling is assigning values to a number of a relationship. It's about relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking types can be just as emotional as a feeling type. And so people get that confused. But I mean, it's true that feeling types tend to be more emotional, but at the same time, thinking types can be just as emotional as a feeling type. So,
right.
And actually the emotions come from back here in the brain. They don't come from the side. So it's how you look at stuff in terms of thinking and logic, analytical terms, or whether you look at it as the relationship among things. And Jung said they're both rational functions. The irrational functions are judgment and our perception, which is intuition and sensing. So your sensing type that sees and likes to do things, and then the intuition is the opposite of that. And so that's the first thing that comes in.
So I'm not understanding it exactly, Jerome, because I certainly like to do things, but I'm in the 99th percentile in the intuitive end of the spectrum. So,
well, we do all the things. It's just that our strength lies in either you're more intuitive, so your strength is in the intuition. That doesn't mean you don't do sensing things. We all sense things,
right?
But you concentrate more on the intuition impressions that you get.
Right. So for example, in terms of what's happened today with me publishing Tim's interview, intuitively, I know that what I published is extremely powerful. And from an action point of view, I made the effort to not only get the interview edited quickly, but also get it published on this YouTube channel. And most people don't have a YouTube channel that has any following.
Yeah, well, there's also what's called versatility. So you've been around enough, and we developed it to be versatile between and among these things. As your first priority really is to develop your strength, your best, your what Jung called the dominant function.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And a lot of the time, if you're not developing your dominant function, you're probably going to be under stress because so you need to find out what is your strength. And that's why Myers-Briggs is a valuable tool.
Sure.
And then it says what your dominant function is and what your supporting function is, and then what your two lower weakest functions are.
Right.
And so it gives you a standpoint. And then when you communicate with someone, you can identify, okay, say this guy's or you're a thinking person, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So you confront them with thinking, not feeling.
Right.
You see a feeling person, this is the way we do when we train leadership groups, is you become aware of who you're talking to and you communicate in their language.
Right.
And you learn how to do that. That's how you establish the dialogue.
Right.
Otherwise, you're just two ships passing in the night,
Yeah. Right.
So,
okay. Well, we've gotten up to nearly 2 hours here, and we haven't even gotten to impeachment, but I think it's going to be around next week, too, and the week after that. So next week, there will be another Sammy's Pizza Kitchen event. So it will not be on Zoom unless I can figure out a way to do Zoom do webinar from my new iPad. I'm not sure I can do that. If I can, I will try to do it. But if I can't, one of our regular weekly members, or not weekly anymore, but one of our local members has asked that we discuss animus next week. And so I plan to do that. He promises to bring 3 women who are involved in psychology in some way. And so it promises to be an interesting discussion. But the one good thing about the new iPad is I will be able to follow the chat, the YouTube chat clearly. So everyone.
Did you get an iPad Pro? Is that what you got?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, that's supposed to be super. Yeah.
Well, it's good, Jerome. Don't buy yourself one until you talk to me. Okay.
Okay.
There are some. I have some reservations, but by and large, I'm pretty happy with it. And my main criticism of Apple is that they don't give you any documentation anymore. So they give you a beautiful box with a nice, colorful picture on the cover, and you open it up and you've got this thing, but what is it? They don't give you any hints about using it. So Opal Sparkles says, it's been many years since I've taken it, but I think mine is INFP or J. Okay, well, it makes a difference. So yes, it would be P or J. I don't know which, though.
There's levels of P and J. You can be judgment one time and move to perception.
Well, sure. I mean, I'm a perceiving person, but if I were in a Marine Corps activity, I would be a very judging person.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Right. So Anthony says, thank you for the evening. Take care and have fun. And Opal says, get the Apple Pencil, which I did. That's helpful, certainly. You have to have that, or you're cooked. Yeah. And Anthony says, stay out of closed ecosystems. Yes, that too. Okay. Okay, a lot going on. So anyway, I urge everyone can buy me a cup of coffee by hitting the super chat at the bottom of the chat if you have interest in supporting my activity, because I'm not independently wealthy, or you can spend $10 a month and join our advanced reading group. And anyway.
We need some more panelist stuff here too.
Yeah, we need some more panelists. So if you're interested in being on the panel, please write to me at skip.conover@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to add you to the panel. Usually we do have other participants, but Miles, for one, had another commitment tonight, and
Nancy
was here briefly, but she hadn't been able to be here from the start, so she didn't come on. And we do have others. And so you're all welcome to be panelists and be on the big screen with us. But if you wish to stay anonymous, then don't. And Sean Smith says, advanced reading group, ? Okay, well, Sean, we have an advanced reading group. It meets at 1:30 p.m. every Wednesday. We request, thank you, Carl. Carl is another of our panel members, so I appreciate the super chat there, Carl. So, Sean, we meet every Wednesday. We have recorded all of our meetings since the beginning. So in the Dropbox for the advanced reading group, we have an entire seminar on ION, 32 sessions, about 50 hours of recording. And we just completed, I think it's our 32nd session, or 30th session, I guess, in Mysterium Conjunctionis, and we're about 2/3 of the way through Mysterium at this point. And so, but all of that material is available, so it's probably at least 100 hours of recordings that are in the Advanced Reading Group Dropbox. And, you're welcome to participate with us. It's not a webinar, it's rather a YouTube, a Zoom meeting. And so we all talk with one another. It's a seminar. We're trying to learn from one another. We have some very knowledgeable Jungian scholars in the group, but we also have beginners, and we try to help everyone along. In a convoy, the slowest ship is the speed of the convoy, and so as we go through life, we're trying to help everyone catch up to where we are. And so, Sean, if you want to sign up, you need to send me an email to okay, that's my email address. Send me an email and I will add you to the group, and you can pay $10 a month by doing that on Patreon, or you can do a $10 donation here, or you can do it through PayPal if you want to. I don't think it's too much to ask, since I'm trying to make this into a graduate level seminar on Dr. Jung's more difficult work. And so if you do it in university, it would cost you quite a bit more. and it just barely covers some of the costs that I have by maintaining these 2 meetings a week, plus my other things that come out of here. So I'll look forward to seeing you. So anything else? Jerome, do you have a comment about the advanced reading group or anything like that?
Yeah, it's just encourage people to sign up. And Skip really has, if you look at each session, he has pictures. He's really organized this thing really well. Plus you can watch, you can listen to the audio tape, everything, and it's really interesting. The group is very interesting in terms of what you said. The variety of people,
right,
is amazing, and then people from other countries, and it's amazing to get together like that. So
right.
I would encourage people to sign up, try it out. If you don't like it,
Yeah, we have regular. A couple of women, one from Brazil and one from France, that join us regularly. And we have a panelist from Canada that joins us regularly, and many other countries. We have one from Latvia, believe it or not. And a few other places. So it's a very interesting group. So thank you very much for joining me tonight, Jerome. It would have been lonely without you.
Well, yeah, I'm just going, where is everybody?
Yeah. Well, I did it solo for
Yeah, you did.
for quite a while. So it's nice to have some company after all that. But
All right.
anyway, so I'm going to terminate this meeting for tonight.
Okay.
And thank you all for joining us.
Have a good one.
Peace. See you next week from Sammy's.